Welcome to Able Pathways podcast. I'm Annabelle Ferber, founder of Able Pathways, where we provide executive function coaching for neurodiverse individuals and professional development for educators. Our podcast explores the windy journeys of learning and growth. Each episode, we travel the unique pathways taken by a diverse range of interesting people as they reflect on pivotal moments in their lives that led to unexpected insights and transformation. Through these conversations, we hope to illuminate the infinite pathways for how we grow and learn. Visit our show notes for links, information about our speakers, and resources mentioned on this episode. In today's discussion, a number of topics will come up, including discussion of alcohol abuse, experiencing cults, bullying, trauma, anxiety, mission kid-specific trauma, institutionalized homophobia, and the process of deconstruction. Today, we're exploring the experience of leaving a high control group with Adam Jones, reflecting on his personal and therapeutic journey. We'll trace the path that led to his discovery of the resources that helped him. I'm delighted to be joined by Adam Jones, ex-evangelical, who will share the remarkable journey.
To start us off, I would love to hear what has been capturing your attention, whether it's reading or watching or listening to something. What's on your list?
Well, I've been listening to a podcast that I've really been enjoying. It's called The Devil You Know, and it's by Sarah Marshall, who is pretty famous for the You're Wrong About podcast and a couple other pretty well loved podcasts. And this is about the Satanic Panic. And she's doing it for the CBC. It's right up my alley, because the 80s and 90s Satanic Panic corresponds with my childhood in an evangelical cult. And so it's just very like people who are talking about it and researching it are articulating things I was living through sometimes in ways that are like even better than I can articulate my own experience. But then she's the most compassionate and incredible storyteller. Every time I listen to her recount research or a story that she's written, I'm always like, why doesn't everyone like center victims like this? Why doesn't everyone think about, trauma in this way? So I'm loving it, even though it's kind of a heavy subject.
It's going straight on my list.
You're,
Right
you
up my alley.
you will love it for sure. It's also strange because there's so many ties you can make to today and the cultural moment we're in today and how we are thinking about in and out groups and morality and just also like moral panics. It's got a lot. It's a very rich text.
I love that. Anything else that's captured your attention?
Oh gosh. I mean, I'm kind of in between books right now, so I'm reading my way through. I decided to read everything that Yukio Mishima has ever written. Don't really know why I'm doing that.
It's cool.
Hyperfixation, I guess. I was like, this is what we're going to do for the year. And I'm most of the way through that, but I don't really have any thoughts about it because I'm trying to just like marinate.
And is there a small joy or a simple pleasure that you engage with recently?
Well, this is kind of a strange way to answer this question, but 2 years ago, before the new year, I think it was in The Guardian, this author was writing about how she keeps a delight journal. And every day you write down something that brought you delight. And you're trying to kind of help rewire your brain to notice, moments of light, moments of joy, rather than our kind of propensity towards the, you know,
Yeah.
setting and sad and dangerous. And I do that. You're supposed to hopefully have something that like you actually thought consciously, like that's delightful. So you're kind of doing not just writing it down, but also engaging throughout the day. But 99% of mine are like something I saw in nature. I sent to Annabelle earlier pictures of the eagle that I saw on my walk. That goes in the delight journal a lot. So
Yeah. Well, and apparently this eagle's quite famous because
Yes.
there's an eagle cam on him or
Yes.
her.
This one was the male because
Oh,
I can recognize him now. I feel very
wow.
sophisticated being able to
Good.
do this. But the male bald eagle is smaller, and so I see them both sometimes. But yes, there is a eagle cam on the Yakima River, and a mutual friend of ours from college, when I shared the picture on social media, was like, "I know this eagle." It was so cute.
I love that.
But
Well,
yeah,
I'm so thrilled you're here today and to chat with you and to share with our listeners. We went to college together.
I know. I have
Um,
I
back
have
in
known you since I was 18 years old, which is
yeah.
redacted number of years ago. Now it doesn't really matter. I was kind of talking about this before we started recording, but everyone likes to talk about how they have these friends that, you might lose touch with them over the years and you reconnect. And it's just this, you can pick up like no time has passed. And for us, in our 20s, we were very close. I mean, there was a summer we not only lived together, we worked two jobs together.
We did?
Yeah, we worked for your dad and we worked
Yeah.
at the caterer. We
Oh,
were like,
Tiger Lily.
yeah,
Yeah.
we were like 20. If there was more than 24/7, that was like how often we were together. But
Yeah.
and we were great friends and we stayed close for a number of years after school, but then we kind of lost touch and then reconnected. There are so many things that we, even in that period of like distance, we're both still very interested in. And I mean, politics, books, so many things that we like talk about. But one of those things was, I guess, religion, the question of religion, and particularly like high control and kind of cult dynamics. And you were interested in those, I think, in some degree, kind of more academically. I come out of that as personal experience. And so we have talked a lot in the time since we've reconnected about those very subjects. And so you broached the idea with me of like coming on your podcast and talking. For me, it's more out of my personal experience than out of like a professional or academic perspective. But I was like, oh, I'll do it. I love to talk about this.
Well, it's a podcast about learning and growth and transformation.
Right.
And you've been through more of that in the lifetime you've lived than most people ever will. And so I think you do have so much to share about how you were able to navigate that as you recognized that the system that you were raised in was not suited for you and the process of how you got yourself out of it and not just like the physically out of it, but the mental, emotional transformation out of a very, very high control environment. My interest in this idea of like, what does it look like to have undue influence? Because we're
Mhm.
all influenced by stuff, right? I'm in the cult of tea. I could
Right.
say that, but there's a difference here. Where do you cross the line into undue influence? And I can think of nobody better to speak personally and academically because you've studied this as well and you understand you've had to I think understand it in order to untangle yourself from that kind of oppression. So I'm so thrilled to chat with you about this.
Well, thanks.
Do you want to give a quick overview of what we're talking about more specifically and then I can ask you questions as we go?
Well, sure. I mean, I can talk about my particular story and background. I was born into a evangelical family. My parents were missionaries. I grew up in the Philippines. My mom is a second generation evangelical. My dad was an adult convert. So they had slightly different takes on religion. In some ways they were pretty standard evangelicals of their era, baby boomer evangelicals. In others they were a little bit more liberal, a little more permissive. But because we were allowed some secular TV and music, we were allowed to question up to a certain degree. And if I had been raised with my parents and grown up in my family structure, I would have some issues that I don't have today, but I would also probably have a different relationship with my faith. I went to a boarding school starting at first grade, and I went to the same school till I graduated high school. And it was in Manila, and it's was not terrible academic experience, but it was extremely fundamentalist. And it was at this era in the 80s and 90s when fundamentalism was really kind of, I think, and Christian evangelicalism in America was really kind of amping up and becoming more like what we see today, especially in like the political sphere. And so exposure to that throughout my childhood was very instrumental in shaping how I related to the question of faith, certainly how I came to understand whether or not I wanted to still be a part of this group. And so I had this like fundamentalist, I mean, it's truly a form of brainwashing before I went to school, but then at school it was just relentless. And so I have it's always a little hard to say like, what was if there is one thing or another that sort of breaks the spell and starts pulling you away. This isn't an original observation of mine, but once one thing does go, so many other things go. And so I can talk more specifically about like what those first things were, but then when I was 18 and I first met Annabelle and I was at Sarah Lawrence, my parents were excited for me to go to a school that wasn't a Christian school. They thought that I was strong in the faith and I'd be able to handle it basically. But as soon as I got out of that high control environment, a lot of things that had been starting to unravel just burst open. And I left the church pretty much right away when I could. But it was a process for me of many, many years. And I think that's more what we'll talk a little bit about, where I almost had to revisit that decision to leave over and over again and leave in different ways and help myself in different ways.
I'm curious, can you recall the first time that you questioned the system that you were in and the culture you were in?
Well, so yes, it's one of those things where I think we are always trying to tell ourselves stories to live. And sometimes we want to find like a story. So I need to be clear that like I'm not saying that anxiety is because of religion or because of a high control environment. I have genetic predisposition, early traumas. I'm an anxious person for a lot of different reasons. But as a really young child, I started to experience profound anxiety around spiritual questions. There's, religious scrupulosity, OCD, to use a really, technical term, definitely something that I've had experience with in my own life. But it was a real revelation to me as an adult in therapy all these years later to look back at that and be able to say, I wasn't just anxious. I didn't understand what I was being told. It didn't make sense to me and I didn't believe it. But the only way that I could experience that cognitive dissonance was through anxiety.
Oh, yeah,
And I think that's the first step for me
yeah.
in leaving was just being afraid of hell and a part of me not understanding how you could have this supposedly all loving or all powerful being that was going to consign the vast majority of humankind to eternal conscious torment. Like it just didn't make sense. And of course, it was very frightening and emotionally fraught for me. But there was also, I think, a part of it that was like, I don't get this. And I can remember adults in my life having to sit me down and I'm sorry to laugh, but it's just it's one of those things where you're remembering trauma and it is kind of funny. I would be trying to go to sleep and I would have a panic attack that was like causing physical, shaking or like all kinds of stuff. And instead of the way that they were trying to like walk me through it was they would sit down and they'd have these theological conversations with me about like the applied versus the absolute will of God, because here I am like, am I going to go to hell? And they'd be like, well, no, you're not going to go to hell so long as blah, 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 blah. And I would just be crying, freaking out. But again, it's not really funny, but it's kind of how I just think it's so absurd now.
It is the absurdity. Yeah.
Two things are happening there, like where I intellectually don't believe what I was being taught to believe, and also just like psychologically Or therapeutically, I'm looking at that and I'm like, that is not how you help a child at that developmental stage to get through this. So I do look at that and I think, you know, that's the first few steps. Um, or the first experience of not feeling like I fit in with this world or this way of thinking.
You were alone with these thoughts, or was there a friend or something you saw on television or some other influence that had you questioning it? Because it feels unusual to me for that you would be questioning what should have just been like absolute truth.
Well, you have to remember my parents are Calvinists, so there's no such thing as like true salvation. It's always a nervous condition, basically. You can't know until the end whether or not you're saved in a lot of ways. So again, no one was really able to say to me, yeah, you're okay, because if I, you know, as a child, like as long as I stayed faithful, I would be okay. But they thought it would be lying to tell me that, oh, you're going to go to heaven. But I can say that and part of the reason why I mentioned like the trauma in regards to all of this too is the first time I started having these fears were in the early years of boarding, when other things were happening for me and other emotional pressures were on and other traumas had occurred. So I think, and I thought for a long time that they were really just manifestations of the trauma, that I was feeling abandoned, say, by my parents. And so I started to be worried that God would also abandon me, because I had been encouraged to think of God as like a father or like a parental figure. So it just sort of slipped, like that sort of mental category moved for me. And I do think that there's some validity to that for sure. But I do also think that even early on, I had questions that I couldn't articulate. And they came out sideways, as a therapist once said to me. And they came out in this way of being like anxious about it, fears.
Yeah. Were there any communities that you were connected to outside of the school?
My parents' house in the rural Philippines was on the church property. Everyone I knew pretty much was involved with their church. There were there were people that lived in our home that worked for my parents. There were people who lived in the parsonage who worked for the church. They were all part of the church. At school, I lived in a dorm with other missionary kids. We went to school and then we would go home or would go to church. I knew very few people outside of the church in my early childhood.
I think it's extraordinary that you broke out and that, you know, you, yes, okay, you came to America. That culture shock must have been very disruptive in a way that maybe helped, but still you had to get yourself there and like, so is there something you could point to or speak to? And I love that you started talking about this, that this is not a completely linear story, and even your memories of them change as you have
I
healed and you reinterpreted and re-understood things. I know I've done that in my life too. Of, you know, at one point in my life, that memory was one thing, and then later on,
yeah,
I interpreted it as an adult and was like, "That was not what happened, girl." And now the memory
right.
is altered by that understanding. But um,
Yeah, there
yeah.
is a big, and I think this is something you can relate to, just because I know we both moved cultures at around 13.
Oh yeah.
It's really, really tough. And you came from the UK and arrived in the US. And my parents would every fifth year live in the United States. And it's an old holdover from how they used to do missions. But we would come to the States and live for a year and then go back to the Philippines. And that was when you're young, it's traumatic enough, but when you're older, it starts to get really traumatic. And that age, American culture is really brutal. Junior high is really tough to break into, even if you haven't changed cultures, you haven't changed schools. For me, it was just so isolating and so terrible. That was a pivotal year
Right.
intellectual development as well. Because
Right.
prior to that, I had been so, you know, protected. And we came to the States and I went to public school and it was nothing like I had been told. It wasn't like the manuals that they gave evangelical kids of what it would be like to go to school, in a public school situation.
I had 21 Jump Street.
Totally. And you're like, wait a minute. Oh my gosh. I realized right before we moved, I was obsessed with the Mike Myers movie, Soul, Mary, and Axe Murderer. Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I thought that like that was why I wanted to be a poet when I grew up, was because I was gonna like be doing finger snappy, like, and somehow be able to afford a huge apartment in San Francisco as a poet. I did have some pop culture stuff, but it was such a steep learning curve. And the indoctrination that I'd received and sort of the like guidance that I thought that I had just wasn't sufficient for that. And I feel so corny to say this, but it's really true. At the time, it was sort of post grunge, but it was this time when like everyone was talking about like being real, man, and like authenticity. And I looked around, and in my estimation at the time, a lot of the Christian kids that I was like at church with seemed kind of hypocritical. Like they didn't really want to be Christian kids. They wanted to just be normal kids, which I totally understand. But at the time, I saw this as like, it was sort of like a big chink in the wall of what separates being a good Christian from being like a evil heathen. It started to fall apart there for me. And the nicest kids, the only people who welcomed me at that school were like, if you think of freaks and geeks, it was like the freaks.
Same. Yeah.
Yeah, right? And
Yeah.
all of a sudden, like the only people who treated me like a human were smoking pot and cigarettes. And so I was like, wait a minute. What is morality? What is, being a good person if like all of the popular kids that go to my parents' church like bully me? I'm not saying it's their fault that I lost my faith. That's ridiculous. But the experience was so different from how I had been taught to think it would happen that it really jarred me. And I started asking these other questions, and authenticity became one of the really important ones to me. And the people who seemed most authentic to me were actually hostile to Christianity. And the people who seemed less authentic were the ones who professed a certain type of Christianity. And so that set me on a totally different path for the rest of high school.
Because then you went back to the Philippines and you had high school to get through.
That's right.
And that whole time, this stuff was brewing and growing. And yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And the other big thing that sort of was happening for me in high school was questions about gender and sexuality. As a little kid, I never wanted to play with boy toys or be like in the mud. I was kind of a little princessy kid, and that wasn't okay. From early on, my dad, both culturally, just from where he's from in the States and his own personal way of being, but then also the overlay of the religiosity, the patriarchal evangelicalism, that just wasn't okay with him. And so I, from a very early age, was a little bit on the outside
Yeah.
as well.
I was just thinking that would have given you room to see things that if you've been able to be more conforming, maybe would
Would
have
have
been
been
harder. Yeah.
exactly. No, I think about that a lot. I think that is definitely true. And then when I got to being, in high school or junior high and started feeling traction, it was very clear to me that I was gay pretty pretty much right away. There's kind of like a few years where I could kind of deceive myself a little bit about the question, but then it became just really obvious. And so I had to start asking those questions too. Part of what fell apart for me was like their script on how it worked was so extreme that I could look at it and say, but that's not what I have experienced. But in the way that I was raised, no one is born gay. No one really is gay at all. People pervert themselves and somehow end up on this path. And I had experience that told me that that wasn't true. Like I had this firsthand experience, but that was really because of the extreme way that that was talked about and how hot that issue was for me. That wasn't really a big thing for me. I didn't think a lot about that directly because it was too scary. When I was in high school, a lot of my criticism that I was able to articulate and that I think was sort of the thread, if we talk about like getting out of the labyrinth, the thread that I like pulled myself out of the labyrinth using was feminism, actually, because I felt not completely male as a little kid. I was always curious about female experience and female perspective in the church. And it was so awful, you know, just hearing some of the ways that pastors would talk about women and the culture would talk about women. And so I just was really felt myself pitted against that. And anyway, intellectually, I kind of was able to think my way out of some of the extreme parts of evangelicalism through the lens of feminism, because while it was personal, it wasn't quite as close as the question of my sexuality. So that it
Mm,
was a little more comfortable to be
mm.
to like be fighting for my sister's sake or for like,
Yeah,
kind of abstracted woman rather than for myself. But yeah.
that's extraordinary. Were there classmates who were struggling with their faith? Maybe not openly, because it sounds like a very high control environment where you would have been punished for that, but in private conversations, or this was just all conversations in your own mind?
A lot of it were conversations in my own mind. There were a few people who I had more serious conversations with. Part of the high control was you would have a conversation about one aspect of it, I think, but you wouldn't have I never sat down and just like poured out everything that was in my mind about this. I think this was kind of my coping mechanism was I had these things that I didn't believe. Like I I didn't believe that women couldn't serve in the church, and I didn't believe that like God was really as vengeful and angry. And I would say to myself, when you leave here, you're going to find people who think like because I knew that liberal Christians existed, but they weren't in my life. And so that was more my thought. But then when I left and came to Sarah Lawrence and came out, my experience was just I was done with it in a real way that I hadn't anticipated before. I guess, how do you know what's going to come before you make the choice or make that leap?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. That's such a brave thing to do from my observations of learning about different high control organizations. There is something they share in common, but you're never going to have an organization where there aren't people in there doubting things or questioning things. So, how do you keep that as quiet as possible? And I think one of the functions I see over and over again is the isolation within. It's interesting because a lot of religions in particular will talk about the beauty of the community, but the community is heavily restricted from questioning or talking about the institution itself. And that becomes so isolating. And that's why I kind of asked you the question, are you even able to have these conversations with others?
yeah, no,
Yeah.
that actually was a part of it. I recently attended a high school reunion. It was small. I mean, it was a small school, so it's a small class, and it was quite a small group of people that came to this reunion. There was a range of people there, some who are still part of an evangelical church or community, some who are part of a liberal Christian one, and some very few who had actually just completely left, myself being one of them. But one of the things that was talked about a lot, and this wasn't so much in regards to questions about faith, it was more actually about questions about trauma, because a lot of the experience of moving kids around, and I'm not making this up, this is like academically true. Like children of missionaries are put in very dangerous situations all the time. Like that's just part of it. It's accepted and oftentimes sort of flaunted by the parents. They are taken to war zones. They are taken to like places where there's starvation. All kinds of things can happen. So the point of all that is to say, when we were together, a lot of people shared stories about trauma that had happened to them. And I heard many, many times that weekend, I had no idea other people were going through these sorts of things. I thought I was all alone. So there really was a sense of isolation that we all experienced, even around those questions. And I guess I don't really have an answer for exactly how it worked, but if I had to guess, I think it has a lot to do with the kind of indoctrination that teaches you that you're so responsible for not only your own behavior, but for other people's behavior. Young girls are told that if a man looks at you with lust, that's partly your fault for wearing something that was too revealing or for showing off your body or whatever. This is something that evangelical parents will do to their children a lot. If you are out in public and you throw a tantrum, they'll pull you aside and they'll say, imagine our neighbors who know we're Christians see you behaving like this. What's that going to do to their relationship with God? You know, you get told that your behavior is directly responsible for other people's life and death, their spiritual existence. So you feel this tremendous responsibility, again, for your own sins and for your own like behavior, but also like you're responsible for everyone around you. And so I think that is probably a big part of why we were so silent about what was going on in our own lives.
But
And
I
why I,
think it's to really taking advantage of a sort of human psychological thing there, because kids are, if they feel like something they think, say, or do is going to hurt another person, we're born empathetic. Our brains are wired for empathy. And so really what you're describing is sort of weaponizing this beautiful, look, there are a lot of terrible things about human beings, but that isn't one of them. That's one of the nice
exactly.
the aspects of ourselves. And they're weaponizing that not just against each other, but then you use that weapon against yourself too. And there's so much limitation to what you could say or do.
I mean, I've heard lots of people talk about it. The person that sticks out in my mind is Danny Lavery talking about this, but where you learn to be constantly judging your own mental script. Am I being holy enough right now? Even just like with your everyday thoughts. And so you're constantly self-censoring, even on this fundamental, like psychological and interior level. That also does, come out in terms of self-censorship with what you tell to other people, how you bond and share. But yeah, I mean, I can't tell you, I left that um, uh, weekend where I had talked to all of these people I'd gone to high school with, just absolutely flabbergasted at what we'd all been through, because I mean, it was really shocking. I mean, I think probably that there's some truth to like that just in general, like we do keep some secrets, but like this just seemed really, really intense.
Yeah. I don't know all the details, but what I'm curious about here, and I think maybe folks might be interested to hear, is just like a little bit more of that journey when you were outside of the system itself. So you weren't constantly in that environment, but you still, of course, had your whole life in that world. And what were some of the pivotal things that helped you really readjust to not being under that kind of influence?
I think that, I mean, I think of there being sort of like two experiences of me leaving the church. Like the first is just this one at 18, 19, when I just sort of made the decision to leave. And over the next, 5 years, I learned more, I read more, I made more decisions about why I didn't believe what I had been indoctrinated to believe before that. But it was many years later, almost 20 years later, before I did any formal deconstruction, 15, 20 years later. And that's when I really left the church in a more complete and healthy way. Like I was kind of saying earlier, I had to learn about regulation, like emotional regulation in a totally new way. I had to learn about just recognizing my own body and my own feelings. And I did that through talk therapy, through the help of, professionals. And then I also had tremendous progress, I guess, from doing just like formal deconstruction exercises. And like, it sounds rudimentary, but it's really true. The resource I use, which is kind of a classic, and there's probably newer ones and different ones, but the one that I used is called Leaving the Fold by Marlene. I always get her last name wrong. I think it's Dwinell, but it's and we can link in the show notes the specifics, but it's really just like a manual for how to deconstruct. And so, you know, you do these exercises, some where you talk about all the horrible things you went through. What's kind of the strange thing is you actually need to spend time thinking about the things you liked, the things that were positive, the things you want to carry with you. And then once you've done all that work, you, for me, I was really up for a while because you actually look at some of the stuff that you went through and you really, the story, like you were saying earlier, the stories that you've been telling yourself shift a little. So things that were funny or that were lighthearted, where you were kind of tamping down how you really felt, all that stuff comes to the top. And you have to sit with those things and feel those things if you didn't feel them, or however that's going to work for you. For me, that's how it was. So that is a big process. I don't like to say things like, I wish I had done that earlier. That wasn't, for whatever reason, possible for me. It just wasn't how my life went, it wasn't how my brain did it. But I'm so grateful that I started that work at all, because I can just see the difference between kind of making a decision to leave the church, but then actually working on some of these mental habits.
What if you noticed from having done that mental, intellectual work where you were changing your neural networks, literally? Yeah, what do you notice?
Well, I mean, not everyone who deconstructs will have had the same kind of like familial structure that I came from and the particular traumas that I went through. So some of it is a little complicated because it does bleed into each other, right? Like these different things. I've had to learn how to self-parent, and that's been a big part of my therapeutic journey. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that I noticed how afraid I still was, like in the first few years after leaving. And it wasn't even just like fear of like big things. It was like I was afraid of the dark. I was afraid of like really kind of strange things because the world was still so populated with those terrors that I had been indoctrinated with. It first started out with just accepting it, and then it softened over time, and I found myself less afraid. And I remember having this experience where I caught myself, like I was out on a walk and I wanted to touch something, and I stopped myself from doing it because I was like, well, maybe that will hurt you, or maybe that will be bad to do that. And it was just a moment of breakthrough where I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, that's just a stick. Like, nothing bad is going to happen. You can touch it if you want. And I actually, I was walking through a grocery store once, and I was just touching stuff as I was walking by, and I didn't know a lady was behind me. And she said to me, you shouldn't do that. What if one of those things bites you? I just laughed and let her do it. But what was funny was, in my mind, I was like, actually, I'm doing that because that's what I've been told my whole life and believed my whole life. And I'm trying to like be out here living like, you know, a free person. And if it bites me, so what? That was like the world opened up for me. And that is another big method of control, is them, the structures tell you that when you leave, your world will fall apart. The world is really dangerous. Disaster will happen to you. Like that's one of the high control myths that you're told to keep you on the straight and narrow. And so that breaking apart was a really beautiful thing. The big thing that I'm trying to learn right now, or that I'm trying to kind of accept, is that like there is no end point. I was just starting to think about what is my goal, like my future goals for therapy. And I just was at some point, actually it was from listening to something that Sarah Marshall said on her podcast, where I was like, wait a minute, there doesn't have to be an end point. I don't have to like get to a point where I'm like, okay, now that is actually the thinking that I was given as a child, that like there's a good and a bad, there's a right and a wrong. If you do it right, God will bless you. If you do it wrong, you'll be cursed and damned. And just like basically kind of putting my middle finger up to this and saying, no, I'm not, I'm going to just heal forever because that's how long it's going to take.
Yeah. I was speaking with a amazing person, Gunjan Cole, who founded a therapeutic horticulture program. And I was chatting with her recently. We were talking about, you just presented that in terms of like breaking through the conditioning from the religion, but that gets reinforced in
Mm.
every book, podcast, movie, TV show because they have to package a beginning, middle, and end. And so everywhere you turn is an idea of beginning, middle, and end. And you could look at us and say, well, we're born, we live, and then we die. And so there's something fundamental about that too. But our internal experience of the world doesn't have that kind of linear path. And we don't know where the beginning is until way later. But it's interesting to think about how that packaging, that narrative that we create is a complicated mix of like purposeful and necessary, but can be detrimental. And depending how you wield it, can be used for control and it can be used for freedom.
I think that's an important kind of addendum to what I was saying. And I also worry that like saying something like, I don't worry, but I don't want my saying that I don't see this journey as having like an end as being fatalistic or like something
Oh,
sad, you know,
yeah,
or discouraging for someone who might be starting out on a journey of deconstruction and be like, wait, this doesn't end. That might not sound very encouraging, but I like what you said about it being used for freedom. It's just like imagine the world opening up in this way that you can hardly imagine when you're so closed up and so, kind of stuck with binary thinking. When it does kind of open for you, there's just so many options.
right. And I recognize that those messages aren't just from high control environments. Again, I see the necessity of it in so many ways, even when I am thinking about, it helps us to understand something to do that. And so you and I had the pleasure of a really amazing philosophy teacher at college. First class, she had us, I don't know if you were in this one, but she had us staring at the duck rabbit.
Oh, I think so. I think so.
I printed her a duck rabbit block and sent that to her, and I
Mhm.
still have it actually. But I think about that a lot because she brought it up in the sense of training your brain to hold two opposing or different ideas simultaneously, and that being a skill that philosophy helps you to develop. Um, but I think the idea of even a story, something with a beginning, we need to hold that idea of like, yes, and
Yeah.
there is a reality that doesn't have any of those components to it. And
Well, the other thing I wanted to say about that is that like you can train yourself. I mean, meditation is probably the most common, way of training your brain to be comfortable with discomfort, you know. There are other ways you can do this, but the one that I have found most helpful is just a form of sitting meditation where you bring awareness to your thoughts and your awareness. And that also has that beneficial quality of making our experience or helping our experience where there isn't like resolution not feel so
yeah,
scary because
yeah,
trained
exactly.
in recognizing it and accepting it.
I feel like I'm really working on that a lot, that idea of not presenting everything as a problem that has a solution. And I think, you mentioned nature earlier, and that resonates with me because that is such a tangible experience of, yeah, nature has problems and solutions, but also just pure chaos out there. And it's kind of scary, right? Because like the unknown, our brain is kind of trained to be careful around the unknown. Who knows? Maybe it's a poison berry, whatever.
Right, right.
I understand why we have that, but yeah, the mental control to like what you're talking about, I think some of the therapy you've gone through and some of the practices are things I want to argue we should be teaching from the beginning.
I would agree.
Um,
And so any freedom starts in my experience, any freedom kind of begets a little bit more, begets a little bit more.
right. That's right. Yeah. And you absolutely have to be aware, another executive function skill, metacognition, like being able to think about the way that you're thinking and observe the way that you're thinking. And it's such a crucial skill again that needs to be taught.
Yeah.
Yeah, and can be easily stunted and manipulated.
That's what I was thinking is like the ways in which it was manipulated in my own experience, and then how the effort it takes to shift it, like once you've been trained to have a sense of metacognition that is punitive or like kind of very rigid, to that honestly was a huge freedom for me when I was like, oh, you're not going to get in trouble for what you're thinking. You can think absolutely anything you want, and that's fine. Because I still have maintained a lot of fear around if I think the wrong thing, that will do something bad to me or to the world. And not just in that magical thinking way, which I think a lot of people have, whether or not you have the sort of manipulation into going that way. Some people just seem to have that fear in general, but in particular, that desire to think the right thing all the time. It's exhausting.
Yeah. I think that your story here of breaking through it, doing the work is just extraordinary. I don't know if people realize how rare it actually is to be able to break free. And you did it on your own, friend.
I think what I thank you for that. It's strange still. It doesn't feel unusual to me. It feels, if it goes back to this feeling necessary. And I talked a little bit about like inner child work and stuff, but one of the profound things about this experience for me is like being able to feel to some extent like there's finally someone holding that child version of myself's hand as he goes through these hard things and is like actually listening to what he's saying. And if that resonates with you, if you're listening to this and that kind of thing resonates with you, or even just like the fear and anxiety pervading the world around you, I think that is such a big part of all of this. Just, take just a small step towards accepting yourself or loving yourself or reaching out for help, whatever seems right. For people who are a little bit farther on the path, I can't recommend doing some more formal deconstruction work. That to me is so crucial. For many years, I actually felt like I didn't need to do that, that I had thought my way out of this, and so I didn't need anyone else's help. Thank you very much. And that's fine. To go through that is just part of life. But I can tell you that the experience of the more intentional way of doing it, that is crucial, because there are things that you don't even know about your own experience that when they're shown to you, you're it's such a relief for someone to name that for you and to kind of
Yeah.
just even by naming it, freeing you in that way.
What would you say looking to the future here? What are you untangling these days?
Well, I mentioned this a little earlier, just sort of kind of the life's work of it all, letting it just take its time, not expecting completion. Just accept that even if I don't feel like I am checking all these boxes off or like doing anything like that, that there's still benefit to what's happening in me. And the other thing, I keep a future self journal, which is like you write just 5 affirmations each day about what you're kind of working on. And what I've been writing a lot in there is about my own power and like recognizing my own power and strength. When you've come through a lot of adversity or trauma, is really what I mean, and you've been spending a lot of time naming that and thinking about that. Please hear me. I'm not talking about a victim mentality or any of this nonsense that people throw around. But when you've been working heavily through that, a lot of times the healing process requires you to sit with that pain and that difficulty, and like you're in that, and you aren't thinking about the fact that you're strong as well. You're not thinking about you're resilient as well. You're healing the trauma and all of this stuff. But that is the seed that's kind of buried in there too. You're also resilient. If you're here and you're wanting to
Mhm.
heal from your trauma, you're here and you're wanting to sit with these painful emotions, like you're also strong. So can you flip that around a little in your mind and think of yourself first as strong and then also as someone who's gone through something adverse? That's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to ask myself right now.
You just duck rabbit yourself again.
Yeah, totally.
Um, yeah, that's beautiful. I love the idea of writing to your future self. Because again, that's distance and imagination, and those are healing things, I think.
Yeah.
Um, what message, or if there's anything you want to add to what you've already said about somebody who is in the process of recognizing or shifting or transforming out of undue influence type environments?
Again, I did mention previously how important I think it is to do some mindful deconstruction work. The other thing though is just like you gotta let some of it is just letting things come out as they come out, like letting go a little bit. You've been so pressured to think the right way, to do the right thing, that it's okay if you just sort of like let things bubble up for a while and let things kind of come out as they do. There's a book with a kind of risque title, but it's not. It's called Foreskin's Lament by Shalom Auslander. And it's his autobiography where he's talking about coming out of very ultra-Orthodox Judaism. And I read that at around 24, 25, and it was a huge influence on my life because, again, it put to words some of the things that I had been through and didn't have words for, even though it was different than my specific experience. And one of the things that he identified that was so profound for me was the anger that I felt. And it's the most bizarre form of anger. It's anger that God doesn't exist. Like when you stop believing in God, you're actually really angry that this person who you prayed to for me, 18, 19 years, you believed was guiding your every move, in charge of atomic physics, suddenly that person doesn't exist anymore. And you are angry. And I'm saying this more as an example of the kind of emotion that might come up. For me, this was a phase I had to go through, just letting it be. I struggled to let it be, even at that point. I really wasn't sure what to do with it. Part of my message is just these feelings will come. So seek help so that you can like deal with them. But also we do have to just accept that these big emotions will come as we are dealing with these big seismic shifts. And I think it's helpful to seek professional help, to learn tools that will help you with it. But the thing that goes along with that is also just accepting that they will erupt for you. And it doesn't have to be sad and scary and terrible. That's not what I'm saying. But you've been sitting on a lot of stuff. And I guess that's why I'm saying get someone to help you through these really big things because you shouldn't have to be alone. You shouldn't have to feel alone in this kind of situation. And you aren't alone. That's what I'm
Yeah.
saying is like there's so many people who have been through this, who have experienced exactly what you're feeling, even though the interior feeling is like, who could know? Like, how could anyone else understand this? But as I would just said, like I read a book, someone had been through it, someone put to page like what I had experienced.
Yeah.
So reach out. And the first step is just admit it to yourself and practice saying that I feel this. And even if it's just hearing how you judge yourself for those things, like if you can do that, if you can start there, that's a huge step towards healing is A, feeling it, and B, being attentive to how you're responding to just your emotions. Because remember, your emotions are just, the Buddhist thing is like clouds over the sky. They're not defining you. They're not forcing you to do anything. They just are. And
Mm.
so acknowledge them and accept them. That's like you were saying, hard for all of us. It's not just hard for people who have come out of a high control environment. It's not just hard for people who have trauma. It's not just hard for men or women and it's hard for everyone. But it is hard. Just one thing to that point about emotions too is like versus intellect. There's also the often that gets kind of divided body and mind too. We talk, that's kind of the classic Neoplatonic nonsense that we live in our bodies and think in our mind, and like they're not just incredibly enmeshed. But if you come from a high control environment that views the body as the repository for sin. That is part of the work that you're doing, is learning to feel your body and welcome those sensations and not just live in your brain. And that's been a big thing for me, is to
Yeah.
try and split those two things: emotion versus intellect, physical sensation versus thought.
Yeah.
Integrate and welcome it all, you know.
Yeah. Viva la revolution.
Yeah.
Um,
Pretty
that's it.
much.
Basically, what we've been talking about today is the patriarchy.
That's right.
um, so I'll end here with asking you if there's, I have such a great reading list from you here to add. But is there an organization, a group, or anyone that you just want to give a shout out to?
Well, I mean, I have done a lot of kind of thinking through ex-evangelical groups. If you even just Google this, you'll find a bunch of resources, podcasts, and people who think about it. The academic Chrissy Stroop has been really important. A lot of the things that she's written have influenced my thinking about it. The books that I mentioned earlier, Jesus and John Wayne, really good. And then again, if you don't have access to, you know, help or therapy, you just want to like do some work to deconstruct, that book, Leaving the Fold, will be a marvelous tool for you, even if you don't have as many, you know, resources as some. That would truly change my life. She identifies in terms of coercive control and undue
Yeah.
influence, things. Not only is she able to like identify them, but she has some suggestions for how to work through, for those of us who lived through, you know, like leaving them, the ways to leave. And again, one of the important things is, what are the positive things that you had in your life? Like, what are some of the strengths that you can bring from these experiences?
And I actually think that's an example of like power of narrative, where it is healing and not harming. Well, thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you, Annabella.
It's going in my new delight journal.
Yay!
Absolute delights to chat with you today. Thank you for sharing.
If you've enjoyed today's discussion, I invite you to share this episode and subscribe to Able Pathways podcast on your favorite platform. Your support helps us to share these meaningful conversations with more people. Visit ablepathways.com or check out the detailed show notes for links to resources and organizations mentioned in today's episode. Have thoughts about this episode or suggestions for future guests? We would love to hear from you. Leave us a comment or email hello@ablepathways.com. Until next time, I'm Annabelle, reminding you that there are infinite pathways to growth. May you travel yours with curiosity and courage.